welcome everyone. I feel really lucky to get to welcome Kregg Hetherington to the Hope Cunningham series. Kregg's research on soybeans, peasant activists, government bureaucracy, and the really surprising ties between managing populations of people and plants in South America has been a real inspiration to me to read and teach. Indeed, his work is taught really quite widely across the anthropology department here at Tufts. When I announced this talk, many people emailed me to say, oh yes, I know this work. So Dr. Hetherington is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University, where he's also the director of the Concordia Ethnography Lab. He's the author and editor of many books and a leading thinker on the politics of food politics and the Anthropocene. These books include 2011's Guerrilla Auditors, The Politics of Transparency in Neoliberal Paraguay, which one reviewer called, quote, a superb, deep ethnography of development that excavates how land politics and the technologies of quote unquote good governance collude to produce campesinos or peasant farmers as firmly outside of proper democratic society in Paraguay. He edited the 2019 book, Infrastructure, Environment and Life in the Anthropocene, which critically, yet hopefully, looks at sites where it has become impossible to disentangle the natural from the built environment. And he comes to us today, having recently published the 2020 book, The Government of Beans, Regulating Life in the Age of Monocrops, which is really a profoundly detailed portrait of living in the shadow of large-scale agribusiness, and one that offers an original approach to the paradoxical consequences of destroying ecosystems in the name of human welfare. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hetherington.
Wow, thank you, Alex. That was just a really incredibly generous introduction. And I'd be remiss to not point out how much Alex's own thinking has influenced mine, and how a couple of choice dialogues and debates with him over the years really were incredibly formative in this project. And thanks to everyone else for being here, and to the series for hosting me. So I will talk mostly about this book today, and the kind of 10 years of research that consumed me talking about or looking at agrarian environmental regulation in the soybean fields of Eastern Paraguay. But the book is also an allegory for the Anthropocene writ large. So it's a local story about why it's so hard to think about welfare in relation to global climate change. And that's the kind of overall theme that I want to get across today. So to put it in context, I can briefly touch on this ongoing discussion around what Donna Haraway and Anna Singh have called the Plantationocene. And what they mean by this is to draw attention to the way that modern agriculture seeks to simplify biological production, leading to cataclysmic losses of biodiversity, as well as increasing carbon content in the atmosphere. And they point to the way that our commodification of plants has lost sight of the entanglements that people have with plants and other living things. And furthermore, they evoke the plantation because they want to draw attention to the histories of colonial violence that have attended to the rise of large-scale agriculture. So the temptation through that conversation is to say that because monocrops arise from a history of extraordinary violence, they're ethically abhorrent in some relatively simple way. And I don't at all disagree with that general sentiment, but from the moment people started asking me to talk about soybean monocrops as plantations, I've been a bit uncomfortable, because while I recognize landscapes like this as tremendous sites of hidden violence, extreme forms of life and death, I'd never want to confuse them with those specific forms of violence and discipline that we associate with chattel slavery. And that's not just because of some sensitivity about historical exceptionalism, although I think the sentiment started there for me, but as much because I think the specificity of different agricultural assemblages is vital to our understanding our way out of the age of monocrops. So in this project, I've tried to draw genealogies between these destructive soybeans and those that involve a great deal more political and ethical ambiguity. And I'm talking primarily today about the Green Revolution that period after World War II, which transformed agrarian technologies, not just in genetics and fertilizers, but in the techniques of government necessary to maintain expanding monocrops. And we can recognize that agriculture that emerged from this period is an environmental catastrophe, one leading to certain well-known problems with climate change and biodiversity loss, deforestation, wildfires, and even the zoonotic illnesses that have so redefined our lives this year. They've also participated in resource and wealth concentration, which on the front lines of this stuff, which I've been writing about for 20 years now, looks almost unstoppable. But I also want to trouble this image by acknowledging that the Green Revolution was, among other things, a welfare project aimed at curbing hunger, disease, poverty, and war by disposing useful plants to greater and greater potency. And it's easy to say that industrial agriculture now poses an existential threat to human well-being, but what if our operative notion of human well-being is entangled in what gave us industrial agriculture to begin with? So I found it useful to step back from that ugly neologism of the Plantationocene and to provide an ugly neologism of my own, Agribiopolitics. Rather than point to particular places in time, this is really a methodological proposition. It's an analytic approach to modern forms of government that seeks to understand the relationship between those institutions dedicated to the health and welfare of humans and those dedicated to health and welfare of plants. And begins with the proposition that agriculture is always based on entangled life projects in which government and human health and plant biology are at times held together and at other times held apart, but always in some form of relation. So the term, of course, comes from Foucault's notion of biopolitics, which I think of primarily as a grand genealogy of the welfare state. I want to be clear here that I'm trying to add another voice to the Foucauldian canon, but I do find the work really interesting, not just from the point of view of methodology, but also for the peculiar lacuna that end up in his story of the rise of the welfare state. So famously for Foucault, biopolitics comes from the inversion of sovereign power, the power to kill or let live, and biopolitics becomes this practice of making live, of regulating and fostering life at the level of human populations. And tellingly, if you go back to the lectures, the first biopolitical intervention that he talks about is the response to food crises in late 18th century France. How Paris was growing and industrializing, and the city could only survive on a stable supply of grain. Shortage of bread, even for a short period of time, was not just a question of individual survival, but of urban and national security. So biopolitics arose as a practice of calculating human biological necessities at the scale of the population and intervening in the grain supply so that hunger wouldn't become revolution. And then oddly, Foucault dropped the question of grain altogether, and for the next decades, biopolitics became much more associated with sexuality, public health, racism, and state violence, not agriculture. In fact, in this story, you can already see agriculture kind of evanescing from the frame. Like other commentators on famine during that period, he generally talks about grain or bread and not specific plants, the wheat or rye that were being made into bread. And one has to go to an entirely different literature to realize that the grain shortages were often caused by new plant diseases that attacked grain monocrops. A concentration of people in the cities produced biological vulnerabilities for humans, while the mirror concentration of monocropped grain in rural areas produced analogous vulnerabilities for plants. So one of these diseases, black stem rot, was so devastating to wheat crops that the French state began to create its first phytosanitary laws at this period, prohibiting planting certain crops that were thought to spread the disease. In other words, these first cases of phytosanitary regulation were born not only at the same time as biopolitics, but for the same reasons. And you can get a story here in which biopolitics of the agribiopolitics of the 1790s produces public health and welfare institution for the cities, while it produces plant health and agrarian regulation for the countryside. And the fact that Foucault only focuses on one side of this equation is telling, because it's mirrored by another spatial predilection, that of favoring Europe over the rest of the world. Because if in Europe the welfare state was in full bloom while he was writing this, its mirror in the global south, primarily Asia and Latin America, was the Green Revolution, that great experiment in supersizing plant life, which was also narrated as a form of welfare. And so we can scale up our dictum with only a little bit of exaggeration and say the agribiopolitics of the 1960s produced the welfare state for the global north and agrarian development for the global south. In Latin America, a critical development literature had already begun in the late 60s, critiquing the way that international development was mostly about enriching the North. But it's telling that in Europe, that brilliant deconstruction of the welfare state seemed to have missed the point entirely that as Europe became the metropole of an increasingly globalized world, it had exported its agrarian issues to the colonies and post-colonies. The project of making Europeans thrive required new technologies to make plants thrive elsewhere. So my project here is not only about trying to fill in agrarian aspects of Cold War biopolitics, but to try, in a sense, to decolonize it by asking what that process looked like at those sites where the great investments in human welfare were being made through investments in plant life. As I mentioned at the outset, this project is also genealogical for me. I'm trying to understand how we end up in this age of monocrops, where agriculture is so expansive, so destructive, and seemingly so untethered from notions of environmental or human well-being at all. So the story I tell takes place in one of the world's most impressive current monocrops, the field of soybeans that sits over large portions of southern South America. In Paraguay alone, this is eastern Paraguay represented on this map, the crop reaches 4 million hectares, occupying about half the country's best soil, in a space that only 60 years ago was mostly dense subtropical forest. Now, I don't want to get into a big explanation of why soybeans, but a few characteristics can help appreciate the enormity of what they represent. Locally, they're cultivated on massive farms, often upward of 10,000 hectares, and many of those are owned by the same investment firms. These are places where kilometers of landscape can have very little in the form of living creatures except these genetically identical plants patented by Bayer or Syngenta in the 90s. And they require constant dousing with a cocktail of agrochemicals. Where they're locally simple, of course, they're networked into extraordinary complex international assemblages, both that create the machinery, technical know-how, chemical inputs, legal scaffolding, and finances necessary to feed the plants, and the downstream processing from the silos to tankers to crushing facilities that separate them out into other products. Soybeans are a quintessential example of what Jason Moore calls cheap nature. That is a sort of disposable form of life that feeds any number of global industries. And the primary one that it feeds is the global meat industry, which we could get back to at some point. But the primary point is that without a global voraciousness for cheap meat produced in feedlots in North America, Europe, and East Asia, we wouldn't have soybeans. I hope the map also evokes something about how monocrops are spatially specific political entities. In this frame, which covers eastern Paraguay, the blob sits over a border, and every year it moves westward and northward, bringing with it new languages and technologies, and is often compared by locals to a military invasion. The governmental configurations that attend to this territory are as much part of what makes the soybeans possible as a Roundup herbicide. And I could talk a lot more about these kind of spatial configurations, but for the talk here, I really want to focus on time. And you can go back to that gray blob that represented soybeans and take a slice almost anywhere in there and see something like these three scenes. If 60 years ago, the landscape was covered in dense forest, 30 years ago, it was a model landscape of small farms and ranches. Soy occupies that territory by asserting a new and aggressive form of life that mostly lives through the elimination of these other two forms of life, pictured on the slide. And it's tempting to think of that progression in terms of a ternarian frontier narrative, which is very popular in South America as well. And it's not entirely wrong. But I think if we think about these landscapes in terms of not just a progression of waves, but rather a set of distinct agribiopolitical assemblages, we can appreciate other elements of what's going on and what's making the present possible. Each of these regimes has its own logic, its own way of understanding plants and plant health, how these relate to human society, what technologies and institutions are needed to hold these relations in place. I'll go into these in a little bit of detail before I get to the ultimate argument, which is that our environmental and environmental justice narratives tend to be structured according to a very simplified version of this triptych. So there's no shortage of people saying we should abolish soy in order to return to the forest, and others saying we should abolish soy in order to bring back peasant life. But this leads to environmental protection of a zoned countryside in which these three landscapes can coexist, held apart by laws and physical barriers. By telling the story as a triptych, I want to open up the possibility that all of these landscapes is a projection now of a monocrop, each maintaining a distinct vision of purity, which is in the aggregate unsustainable. Together, they conspire to make soybeans what they are today. So in the first of these chapters, the global story is that at the end of the 19th century, the science of crop improvement took a massive step forward with new genetic techniques producing hybrid plants, which had a productivity and force never seen before in farmers' fields. This started an entrenching of the institutionalization of crop science, which would make agrarian governance more and more complex throughout the 20th century. Just to underline how important this moment is for a country like Paraguay, this guy, Moises Santiago Bertoni, a Swiss botanist and polymath who arrived in Paraguay in 1886, is still remembered today as the grandfather of national science, a kind of Thomas Edison for Paraguay. He built the country's first agronomy school, started the first scientific journals, and he wrote 500 books on and articles on a whole bunch of different topics, ranging from botany, philosophy, entomology to anthropology. And he's still remembered today. There's lots of Bertonis in Paraguay. If you want to talk about this Bertoni, you just call him the sage, El Sabio Bertoni. But although his personality looms large in Paraguayan history, few people know what to make of his published work these days. So I talked to lots of agronomists and anthropologists about his legacy, and all had this kind of sideways way of saying that the writing itself wasn't of much value. And for the botanist, Bertoni had an annoying way of anthropomorphizing plants, of ascribing to them social values like egalitarianism and democracy, while becoming overwhelmed with a mystical reverence for plant life themselves, which they thought made his texts kind of disqualifiable. Anthropologists had the opposite problem with the way that he biologized Paraguayan culture, producing a theory of mestizaje that glorified racial mixing of humans and plants, with what would later be read as having fascist undertones. His thought in general was part of a philosophical movement known as vitalism. And in its most basic form, turn-of-the-century vitalism posited that all life processes were animated by what they call a vital force that transcended the physico-chemical composition of matter. And these are not his terms, but he used them, he adopted them from other thinkers. For Bertoni, this vital force resonated most in the forest, was always about relational properties, about beings coexisting with other beings and thus becoming stronger. And as an agronomist, his whole point was that a farmer ought to assemble beings together so that their relational properties would create greater strength. He wrote practical guides to growing crops that included psychological, social, and spiritual advice alongside cutting-edge agronomic techniques that he developed. And he advocated forms of farming that embraced multi-species complexity and certain forms of conservation. There's a kind of earnestness about relationships that allow one to think about the complexity of agriculture in his work in a way that later agronomists would tend to obscure. And this way of talking, as I said, vitalism of this sort was pretty common in his time. And he was resonant with figures as diverse as Justus von Liebig, Rudolf Steiner, Jose Vasconcelos. But it more or less disappeared after World War II, and with good reason. The best known versions of this style of thinking were fascist, and creating better humans was always in the fascist imaginary linked to creating better plants and animals. Humans had, Mussolini had his noble wheat, Franco his Spanish pigs, and Nazis had German potatoes that needed to be protected from invading hordes of foreign insects. Fascist agronomy was what we today call post-human, the study of relationships between human communities and their non-human companions. And there are more than just resonances here. Paraguay had its own short-lived fascist government, which appointed Bertoni's son as their ag minister. And only a decade later, Paraguay would notoriously become welcoming to Nazis fleeing the Nuremberg trials. In Paraguay, as elsewhere, biological racism began to fade out of the social sciences, which became much more liberal after World War II. Speculation about human character of farmers faded even more quickly from agronomic science. The weird thing is that while anti-racism for the social sciences meant a complete change of epistemology and methodology, in agronomy, very little changed other than political rhetoric around the margins of crop technique. So after the war, fascist agriculture was converted into liberal agriculture using the same techniques, but now saying that one had to create super wheat, not to fortify a nation of superhumans, but more abstractly, to feed the world. The human agronomy became the human, of human agronomy became a universal human, subject to equal rights. But the plants and animals were still everywhere races to be genetically improved in more and more sophisticated ways. By leaving out the relationships between people and plants, what was lost was the ecological sensibility of thinkers like Bertoni, who were relegated to the mystical margins of alternative agriculture. And this happens the world over, obviously, but this is the Paraguayan version of it. So in the second chapter of this story, chemical advancements achieved during World War II are reinvested into agriculture, offering new pesticides and fertilizers to improve and protect new crop varieties in a way that offered for many extraordinary promise for solving food shortages, no longer at the level of cities, but at the level of the world. In Paraguay, the Green Revolution was actually about cotton production for the international market, and redistribution project aimed explicitly at promoting the welfare of hundreds of thousands of rural families. And there's a lot of complexity here I can't get into. This was also a period of brutal dictatorship. But the main point is that in places like Paraguay, the Green Revolution harnessed the insights of fascist agriculture and coupled it with social welfare. Not that there, and note that there's already an important elision here. If the Green Revolution motto was to feed the world, and in its initial years, it had an explicitly public health agenda. In practice, it quickly became more abstract, a welfare project aimed at raising standards of living. Feeding the world and economic growth quickly began to look like the same thing. So this regime had a really different global epistemology to it, less connected to 19th century German Romanticism and more to Anglo-American liberalism through international development aid. The person in charge of this project was actually Moises Bertoni's grandson, Hernando, who left his grandfather's ag school on a Rockefeller grant in the 40s and came back to become Minister of Agriculture. He leveraged international money and expertise to make this happen, from French cotton scientists who developed the new varieties, the Inter-American Development Bank, which built the new ag schools, the USAID and the Brazilian government that built highways and ports for export, and finally the Alliance for Progress, which funded a new land reform that the U.S. was promoting throughout the region and throughout much of the world as a bulwark against communism. The combination of these new technologies and new available land in the forest rapidly transformed the region, creating hundreds of cotton colonies in what had been the middle of the forest. It looked like this. Now, during the 60s and 70s, cotton was the most important plant in the Paraguayan economy, and it drove rapid economic growth, sometimes as much as 12% per year. Families lived and died on the success of their cotton production. And a whole nationalist ideology developed in which upwardly mobile peasants saw their identities linked to their ability to produce white gold. Cotton was also a way for the Stroessner dictatorship to extend itself throughout the forests, creating powerful client networks for the ruling party and converting it into one of the most long-lasting regimes of Cold War Latin America. And yet when you read the welfare policies like this one, they make very little reference to actual cotton. Rather, they talk about harnessing human labor through access to land. And as such, they have little to say about the actual biological relationships that are being hinted at in this picture. As with previous large-scale reorganizations of agriculture and human populations, the Green Revolution was an incredibly violent process, which benefited particular Paraguayan humans and particular Paraguayan plants to the exclusion, sometimes annihilation of others. So cotton began the process of converting the countryside into a sort of simplified landscape appropriate for large-scale monocrops. Indeed, it was the condition of the land reform that beneficiaries immediately started destroying the forest. This scene is about 2 years into the creation of one of these colonies, in which, in legal terms, destroying the forest became the first act of possession, allowing peasant men, and only men at the time, to express themselves as citizens and economic actors by cutting and burning trees. So during this period, Paraguay was the site of the fastest deforestation in the world. It was also the site of a major international human rights scandal, the genocide of the Ache Guarani who lived in these forests. Thousands of Ache died, rounded up, infected, and deprived of a way of living from the forest before an international campaign slowed down some of the worst violence. And reading the literature on genocide offers a window into the agribiopolitical contradictions of the era. A handful of European and Paraguayan anthropologists joined up to create an international campaign against the genocide of the Ache, but they were opposed by a number of US anthropologists and lawyers who argued that the violence did not technically constitute genocide since it was not organized by the state with a specific intent to erase a particular group. And this is the sort of perennial problem of genocide studies. The deaths were due to the advancement of agriculture. They argued they were similar to many indigenous societies disrupted by peasant frontiers throughout Latin America and North America historically. In other words, mass killing didn't count as genocide for them if genocide was primarily about agriculture. Like development narratives about land and labor then, social justice narratives tended to leave environmental factors out of the equation. Indeed, it required that the environment remain invisible in the story of genocide for it to count. This, more than anything, is the reason I think it's useful to talk about agribiopolitics as a form of relational violence, rather than the purest understanding of biopolitical crimes as something committed only against particular groups of people. Once we open up the discussion to settler frontiers to include genocide and ecocide together, regardless of intent, we also open up new ways of understanding other forms of violence that monocrops always bring with them. So the cotton frontier, of course, having destroyed trees and people in this area, it established itself in such a way that attracted other beings. The first of these were fungal infections in the seeds and roots of cotton plants, later caterpillars, and finally boll weevils, which in cotton history always manages to find the cotton plantations. At this point, there were about 2 million hectares of cotton which get destroyed by the arrival of the boll weevil. The same project to create rural welfare through extensive violence against trees now turns inwards, creating a public health system for cotton. This is when Paraguay finally establishes a phytosanitary system, doling out increasingly toxic pesticides throughout the region. Eventually, the costs of killing became too high and cotton collapsed, and with it, the entire welfare scheme which depended on it. Now, between 85 and 92, Paraguayan agriculture changed again, and partly this was due to a geopolitical realignment towards the end of the Cold War. I don't want to say the boll weevil was the only actor here. International development agencies that had fostered agrarian reform and crop science in order to prop up dictators like Stroessner suddenly changed the way that they gave out assistance. When they stopped doing this, they also stopped promoting cotton. In fact, they stopped promoting specific plants altogether and replaced their crop programs with programs for transparency and good government and democratic transition. This is the moment when soybeans, a crop that the government had barely paid attention to previously, began to enter cotton territory. Soybeans were a neoliberal product, a flex crop intended for processing overseas that was grown at very large scale, required significant private capital investment, and a constant barrage of chemicals to stay alive. Cotton growers slowly got displaced from soy because they couldn't buy into the new system. It was simply too expensive, because soybeans didn't require much labor, so they didn't redistribute wealth in that particular way. And because clouds of pesticides began wafting over the countryside, this countryside now denuded of trees, getting into people's houses. As a result, soy also concentrated land and wealth, getting rid of people, houses, gardens, and trees from the landscape, gathering up the destruction that cotton had wrought, and deepening it in the name of feeding an increasingly voracious international meat industry. In this most recent agribiopolitical regime, then, from the 90s onwards, monocrops were no longer about feeding any particular people, not even really about sustaining any promise of welfare, with all the contradictions that that had implied. Feeding the world now became completely reduced to participating in economic growth. We also see the reemergence of a kind of vitalism, but one which is stripped of relationality, where biotech harnesses the vital force of particular purified organisms by chemically isolating them from other organisms. And people on the soy frontier will often talk about, it's the soy doing the work, it's the miraculousness of soy that creates the potential for this, which is very resonant with these early forms of vitalism, but again, stripped of the relationality. So monocrops like this one, as many people have pointed out, including Alex, are a fragile form of life that require an immense global technical apparatus just to stay alive. The ag industry, the exploding university programs in basic science and agronomy, the network of private labs, and the massive new government regulatory departments are all part of the apparatus that holds this form of life in place. But that complex assemblage is also elsewhere. In situ, the life being promoted is violently simplified and stripped of any meaningful connection to the well-being of other living things. Together, the pesticides, erosion, degradation of the forest, and dispossession of smallholders drive this disintegration of what used to be called rural welfare. Agrarian technology apparatus once justified in the name of rural welfare now turns against rural populations. The prevalence of pesticides, for instance, used to be thought of as something that made people's lives better. Now they're thought of specifically by those same people as something that threatens human life, driving an exodus of the poor to the cities. Of course, it's not as though neoliberalism is without its notions of justice for both humans and aggregates of other living beings that have increasingly come to be called the environment. But they've also undergone a transformation. So first, both human thriving and environmental protection have been reduced to rights talk. Second, they remain as distinct as they were during the Cold War, when ecocide and genocide were definitively pried apart. So to be a little bit more specific about that, modern environmentalism, which in Paraguay was born very suddenly in the 1990s through another kind of confluence of things, but very wrapped up in this story, is overwhelmingly concerned with deforestation and the destruction of charismatic ecosystems. It's built of a contrast, in other words, between two parts of our original triptych. They lead to the institutionalization of nature parks that cater to middle-class visitors looking for elusive megafauna, or to anti-deforestation laws that mandate that 10,000-hectare soy farms put aside a percentage of space for reforestation. This usually ends up looking like a eucalyptus plantation. On the other side, social and environmental justice politics remains focused on the other contrast in that triptych, romanticizing what rural welfare was all about and trying to hold it in place against the onslaught of land concentration and pesticide exposure. Here, populist laws aimed at preventing smallholders from selling their land are complemented by phytosanitary laws limiting the most egregious forms of pesticide use. From 2005 to 2015, for instance, the most hotly contested piece of agrarian regulation in Paraguay was over what people called living barriers. This was something that soy farmers were mandated to plant along the edge of their soy fields to mitigate pesticide drift into other people's homes, into schools, and onto communal roadways like this one. I make the argument in the book that this seemingly straightforward intervention had almost no effect on pesticide exposure, but it did contribute to a cascade of political scandals that eventually led to a governmental coup in 2012. The agribiopolitical aesthetics here, though, are what really interests me, and I find them striking. On the one side of the barrier are soybeans, whose life force is maximized in the name of capital accumulation to the detriment of almost all other forms of life in their midst. On the other side of the barrier are places where humans can live, but humans who've been reduced to a sort of bare life, the right not to be doused in toxins. Only at the highest level of abstraction is there any sense that people and plants might profitably thrive together in this picture. Once the phytosanitary form of the barrier became the leading agribiopolitical symbol, it took other forms as well. So from activist imagery that expressed the defense against monocrops in starkly militaristic terms, to those that expressed their newfound fear of agricultural technology by building bulwarks against what they saw as a territory of lies. And there's a whole other project I could talk about here, which is about this sort of knowledge politics in here. The other side of it, in an extension of which deserves its own study, over the last several years, soy lobbyists have moved to exert control over science curriculum at the National University and mounted a full takeover of the National Science Council with the express purpose of choking off funding for epidemiologists who are studying pesticide exposure. The year after the coup, the new president invented a whole new form of living barrier, an intervention that brought the agribiopolitical logic of the age of monocrops to its logical, if absurd, conclusion. And this time, instead of planting elephant grass or sugarcane to protect neighbors from pesticides, the state planted police to protect the pesticides from neighbors. And it's a scandalous picture, and these scenes didn't last for very long because they were just too egregious. But it says something about the place we've arrived at, where human interests and plant interests are opposed to one another, held apart by these barriers of grass and police. In either case, the eventual outcome seems to be a world of increasingly segregated plants and people. So by way of conclusion, I just want to underline that the age of monocrops in which we live is an echo of a way of thinking that has been brewing for centuries, but was really entrenched after World War II, which had a profound effect on the critical study of agriculture. Among other things, it fortified a taboo against kinds of thinking that insist on deep entanglements between people and plants. It's not just that we've inherited a form of capitalist agriculture that can only improve through simplification, speeding up, reducing labor costs, and killing competitors, but also that we've inherited an environmental justice narrative that can only understand human welfare as a singular ethic that stands outside of the welfare of other living things. What makes the post-war moment so important is not just about the failure of the imagination, but about the massive investment in scientific and governmental apparatuses that were inscribed with these blind spots during that period. These sorts of living barriers are not merely curious monuments to bad philosophy, but extrusions of complex siloed bureaucratic systems which are continuously deepened. The health and welfare of humans is in one set of buildings, the conservation of the forest is in another, those promoting agricultural growth are in another, and you know, you can specifically see that in the spatialization of government offices in Asunción. Each with their awesome purified technical knowledge, which is hard to do without, and each with their own legal apparatuses, which don't easily mingle with each other. Even when there are lots of bureaucrats in there who sort of recognize the need for that mingling to happen, it's very hard to make it move because of this ossified bureaucratic system. A first step here might be to insist that agriculture be ever present in our discussions of human well-being. This isn't about learning the name of the farmer who grew your coffee beans, nor is it about imagining a zero-sum scenario where every increase in the standard of living of one organism is balanced against the destruction of another. But it's about keeping alive an awareness that when we idly talk, for instance, about how increased meat consumption in one part of the world is an index of human improvement, some other part of the world, some other set of bodies, human and more than human, are shuddering under the strain of that improvement. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Craig, for a really stimulating discussion. So the Q&A is open. Anyone should feel free to ask questions. I'll just kick us off with a totally open-ended one, given that much of my research has been on meat, as you know, and I think probably many of the students here are from a class called American Meat, which is just simply an empirical question. I've read in much of your other work with peasant activists and so forth that discuss how soy kills, the violence of soy eliminating from the ground. But I was wondering in this region how meat is understood, right? And especially when this entire region has been converted to export soy for meat production elsewhere. So just an open-ended question as to how people understand the power of meat-based agribusiness and so forth on the ground.
So I think there's a whole bunch of things I could say about that, but I'll maybe reduce it to three main points. On the one hand, this is South America, which is famous for its beef consumption and production, right? And diets throughout Paraguay uphold the eating of meat and pork as sort of the ultimate dietary aspiration. So there is a contradiction in there in saying that people who want to be able to eat all this meat and who see their own human well-being associated with meat consumption are upset about the expansion of soy fields, which go to feed meat. And I would say that the separation is so total that, in fact, most campesinos being displaced from these places have no idea what the soybeans are for. They've just never really understood it. And so there is that kind of level of abstraction. And part of the kind of higher level activism that goes on is about trying to make people understand that relationship. At the same time, that sort of value of of beef in the area is always associated with a kind of a low intensity ranching, which is completely different from what the soybeans promote. So if soybeans are going to feedlots in other parts of the world, actually the most alarming thing is the way that the meat industry in South America is now being turned into a feedlot industry. So those ranches are being concentrated into feedlots, which create, in economic terms, they create kind of value-added soybeans. What you do is you take the soybeans, instead of exporting them raw, you force feed them into animals there, and then you export that meat. And I think that's probably the next frontier of what's going to happen here. Each of these soy areas is going to start to produce its own feedlots, which at this point are small in comparison to American and Canadian feedlots, but they're certainly on the grow. And meat exporting, soybeans, it feels like soybeans have probably reached their scale. Meat exporting from Paraguay is starting to increase quite dramatically in the last few years.
Great, thank you. I'm going to start with a question from Katja Forsyth, which is, how has the state allowed / supported land grabs by international financial capital? And how is that, if so, how is that tied to soy plantations, seed and pesticide capital?
Yeah, so thanks, Katja, for a great question, and I also have too much to say about that. But I think maybe the way to describe it is, on the one hand, to say that this kind of land grabbing, I think, happened in Paraguay in a way that took a lot of people by surprise. So if you look at the way I described this kind of three-stage frontier situation, cotton, the cotton economy was all about expanding into the forests, and that assumed that there were a lot of forests there at a certain point historically, and there are a whole bunch of weird geopolitical reasons why deforestation didn't really start happening until the 50s and 60s. But the cotton frontier was expanding, and because it was expanding, there's this whole nationalist ideology of empty space that was out there, in a way very similar to settler colonialism in other periods and times in other places. So that meant what the government actually was promoting was, on the one hand, cotton expansion in one place, and on the other hand, foreign investment in larger farms in other parts of the country. And what really happens, what really precipitates this land grabbing conflict, is the moment when those two frontiers meet. The forest kind of gets squeezed out of the middle, and suddenly you have these investors coming mostly from Brazil and Argentina, buying up these large tracts of land and showing up in campesino communities with more money than anyone had seen before, and buying up land that way. So I guess what I can say is that the government was not exactly promoting any of this, but it was very laissez-faire about it. And perhaps ironically, the being laissez-faire about the expansion of large farms while promoting the expansion of small farms kind of exacerbated the situation, because land reform keeps land prices very low in comparison to other countries, and that made a lot of this land extremely cheap for people. So I wouldn't describe it as a specific project. There are lots of scandals one can talk about government corruption, giving huge swaths of land to different clients and so on. But the larger problem is sort of a set of circumstances in which nobody's really paying attention to how land is distributed, until the point where the soy sector becomes so powerful that the idea of actually doing anything to curtail it became basically unthinkable.
Building on questions of government and complicity, this is from Aram Satar. Could you please talk a bit about the complicity of higher ed / academia, especially in the United States, in normalizing and helping train the most efficient water and food sector specialists, for instance, who go and work in these very sectors to the detriment of so much else?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have too much specific to say beyond what's already evoked in your question, but I think it's right on the nose, right? When we think about the Green Revolution, what we're talking about is this transfer. It's not just a creation of new knowledge; it's a transfer of particular kinds of specialized knowledge from the metropole to these other places. And so, these little moments in the talk where I talk about, for example, Hernando Bertoni going to a Rockefeller school in Costa Rica in order to find out about all these new techniques, that's a very specific intervention that's made through an investment in crop science, first in the US, that's expanded then into these regional schools in Latin America and Southeast Asia, and then brings people in. So key folks from all of these countries end up training in schools in Mexico, Costa Rica, and the southern United States and Puerto Rico. They end up sort of training there in these kinds of techniques and then transferring that knowledge into these other places. And they then become kind of scientific laboratories. So one of the ambiguities of this, I spent a lot of time with crop scientists on the frontier here, and this is one of the few places in Paraguayan society where you can train to be a scientist in all of the great things that implies, right? This freedom to experiment with things, this ability to have an apparatus of knowledge making at your disposal. And people were really loath to give up that way of life, and very happy to have that kind of possibility. But all of that was being underwritten by this larger project of agrarian development that starts in the late 40s, and that is still in place today. So I think the sort of welfare justifications of a neo-colonial agrarian program is deeply entrenched, as I said, not just in the institutions of government, but in the institutions of universities, and of the very way that we think about interrogating what crops are all about. And I guess that's the last thing I want to say here, in the way that I said that a lot of bureaucrats have lots of really neat ideas about what they might want to do, but find the institutions not pliant to those ideas. I think people found that in these crop research centers exactly the same way. A lot of these people are very ecologically minded in the science that they want to do. And yet at the end of the day, they know what's paying the bills is whether X combination of glyphosate and 2,4-D is going to kill X beetle, right? And that becomes the sort of bread and butter of how these institutions function. And it's very difficult to imagine weaning them apart without science in general collapsing in the country.
Thanks. So transitioning, perhaps towards potentially better futures. A question from Sophie Dolberg is, have you seen examples where the activists or people advocating back to the forest and the folks advocating for back to the peasant farms have found ways to work together effectively?
Yes, and always at very small scales. But I did think, so one of the things that in the arc of the book, I'm really talking about this particular moment in governmental regulation, where a progressive government attempted to create these barriers and other sorts of interventions that were kind of like that. Again, really well-meaning people trying really hard with the tools at hand to create large-scale change. When they were thrown out of government quite violently in 2012, many of them they decided that their energies were best spent on much smaller projects where they could more effectively bring these things together. So I guess I want to underline that none of these projects ever went away. That there has always been an alternative agriculture from the late 19th century onwards, right? And Bertone and people like him have always been part of this thing. And whether you want to call it, organic agriculture, which comes out of the 40s in this kind of German Romantic moment as well, or permaculture later, or agroecology or agroforestry in Latin America, as most people call it. These are there. It's not that people don't know how to produce food in ways that respect these kinds of things. It's more that it's very difficult to scale them up at any level when the preponderance of agricultural energy is behind this. So definitely, when I want to go to South America and hang out with people who I feel are doing something hopeful, I end up on these relatively small kind of agroforestry plots where small groups of campesino activists have figured out how to monetize something small in under forest cover, that allows them to live, quite humbly, but nonetheless in this kind of economic niche. What I haven't seen is any serious attempt at the level of governance, or even at the level of the national university, which is where I think the next step would be, to kind of think about these sorts of movements at a larger scale. Because again, the preponderance of political and economic energy is so behind this form of production that it's hard to get around. And you end up fighting these little battles, like the one I mentioned about the National Science Council in Paraguay being overtaken by soy lobbyists. That's a huge consuming kind of a battle that people are then trying to fight against this one front in what would be the possibility of even scaling any of this stuff up.
I think you've started to touch on this, but this is a question from Kathy Stanton. Fantastic work, thank you. Paraguay is, of course, by no means the only nation where concerns and policies are so siloed between human and plant and so forth, treated as separate things. Do you see models for more holistic approaches anywhere at present?
That's a really great question, and no, I'm not sure that I have a good answer to that question. Other than the one that I already started to touch on, which is that I think there are plenty of places where small scale stuff is happening, and outside of Montreal and Quebec, I can point to any number of organizations of small farmers that are managing to help each other out at some kind of scale in order to think agriculture differently, but also practice agriculture differently. And the same thing would be true of Paraguay. But no, it's very hard to see any program that sort of goes beyond sort of boutique bureaucratic experimentation that would really confront this kind of thing. Now, that being said, actually, maybe I'll put one other little spin on that, which is to say, I wouldn't want this project to come across as a full-blown critique of everything to do with soy, or even everything to do with monocrop plantations of one form or another, because I do think that at various moments these attempts to think different ways of doing things, usually in response to an ecological crisis, are useful places to start. So integrated pest management would be one of the examples, right? Where that's an innovation in ways of thinking about pests, which sort of push in the right direction. Now, the preponderance is still, how do we use integrated pest management in order to make fields like this work? But nonetheless, I would say that there are always these sorts of degrees, and to the extent that agrarian activism can sort of dig in on those moments where things are pushing towards a more relational understanding of agriculture, then that's always a good thing to be doing. I wrote an article a few years ago partially about what was called the responsible soy movement in South America, and I was actually really troubled at that point by the activist arguments that what was called responsible soy, which was sort of a certifying technique for saying this soy is going to have less ecological and social consequences than other soys. The pushback against that was that it was a greenwash, and in doing that, they dismissed everything that was going on in those conversations about how you might grow soy in a way that didn't exploit labor quite so much, that didn't kill people quite so much, that didn't use pesticides quite as badly, or that didn't deforest. Right, all of that was part of the conversation of responsible soy, and I think there's a good reason why people called it a greenwash, and nothing really good came of it. But I think there were opportunities there where people could have articulated more interesting visions of what agriculture could be, and it was perhaps an opportunity for linking sort of the most progressive sides of the soy industry with the most open sides of the activist groups in order to think things through. So certainly that's something that in my own activism around these things, I'm always kind of looking for those opportunities where you can see open-minded people on either side to move things up, even while I find the structure of the way most of this is produced awfully suffocating.
Thank you. So we have 3 minutes, and I want to sneak in this last question. It's one I asked a lot, and I'd love to hear your response. So this is from Edward Buchert. Over the past few years, I've incorporated quite a lot of soy-based products into my diet, especially as TVP, and hadn't realized the issues involved in their production. Could you comment on the ethics of eating soybeans or directly consuming soybeans as humans?
Yeah, I mean, so do it. I guess would be my first response. Yeah, no, this is funny. I actually devoted a chapter in my book to this question because it always comes up, and I always forget to find a way to incorporate a better answer to it in the talk itself. But yeah, that's one of those things where to think in purest forms about soy as a problem might lead one to think that eating tofu is actually worse than other things. But in fact, in eating tofu, rather than in taking the raw materials of that tofu and force feeding it to a cow and then eating the cow, which is what most of us are doing most of the time, the impacts of that are always going to be much, much greater. So I think there is a way in which the kind of agrarian ethics that I hope comes out of this sort of discussion is never going to be purist, right? There's always this understanding that as we consume things, we're killing things, and we're creating systems that are going to be problematic for some people and some ecosystems and so on. There's no way to get away from that. And so then the question is, if you want to reduce an ethics of eating to individual choices, the main thing is to think about the complexity of how whatever it is that's on our plate is connected to other kinds of things. This is why I also want to resist sort of the idea that we become ethical eaters by knowing exactly where something comes from, and making sure this is the kind of coffee bean example, right? It's like we can feel good about our use of coffee beans as long as we know the name of the producer in the highlands of Costa Rica who produced it. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'd much rather sort of think much more complexly about the way that our food choices engage in these huge assemblages whose impacts are usually invisible to us. So I want this really actually to be about, or what I want people to become aware of is the meat industry more than the soybean industry, even though you point to the soybeans in order to understand that meat is out there. And to the extent that this makes people eat more soybeans, that's great. That'd be the way that I'd push it.
Thanks, Kregg. Please join me in thanking Kregg for his talk.